All right. Good evening, everyone. We're very excited to have you here this evening. Very timely presentation. So tonight we'll be speaking with Terry Golway, and he'll be presenting on his new book, I Never Did Like Politics, How Fiorello LaGuardia Became America's Mayor and Why He Still Matters. My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. If this is the first time you are joining a Village Preservation program, just want to briefly tell you a little bit about the work that Village Preservation does. We were founded back in 1980 to help document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. And we've helped secure landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings. And we host 75 to 80 free programs like this throughout the year. We are a member-based organization, so your support is critical in helping us do the work that we do, from our advocacy work, our education work, and our public programs. That's why I ask you to please scan that QR code that you see on your screen. Take a moment, consider leaving a donation, or better yet, become a member of Village Preservation. And this grants you advance notice to our programs so you can book your spot well ahead of the general public. And when you're at our website, please go ahead and check out a lot of the free educational resources that we have available. We have an incredible selection of maps and an image archive that shows all periods of Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo's history. A really great free and fully accessible resource for you to use. Now, if you're interested in knowing a little more about our programs, here are our upcoming programs in October. The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of New York City on October 1st, the Great Bars of New York City on the 8th of October, and the Battle for Intro 2 on the 15th of October. These are all in-person programs, so please secure your reservation as quick as you can. If you are interested in registering for those programs, head over to villagepreservation.org/events. Now, before I introduce our guest this evening, just some quick Zoom protocol. While Terry is giving his presentation, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A feature, and you'll see those at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. And then we'll be asking those questions on your behalf at the end of his presentation. All right, so our guest this evening is Terry Golway. He was senior editor at Politico and the author of several works of history, including Frank and Al and Machine Made. He's been a columnist and city editor at the New York Observer and a member of the editorial board of the New York Times and a columnist for the Irish Echo. He holds a PhD in U.S. history from Rutgers University and is taught at the New School and the College of Staten Island. Terry, a very big welcome to you. It's great to have you here this evening.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
All right.
And now I share my screen, I believe, right?
Yep. And I will vanish into the shadows, but I am here if you need me.
Okay. Just bear with me 1 second. So we see the PowerPoint then before I start, right? That's the most important question.
Yep.
No, great. Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks to William for setting it up. And as William said, if you're interested in the village history, village preservation, please consider joining or sending a donation. It would be a great help because, as we know, the village is one of the most historic neighborhoods in New York City and one of the best preserved. Fiorello LaGuardia, who lived in the village, could walk down some of the streets in the village and say, wait a minute, this looks awfully familiar. So he is the subject of my talk today. He's the subject of my most recent book. And it's sort of an interesting title, don't you? Of course, we might all feel that way today, right? I never did like politics. On a day like today in New York, maybe Fiorello was speaking for all of us, but that is an exact quote from Mayor LaGuardia. He said it in 1943 when he had been a politician since 1914. And the backstory to that is pretty interesting and gives you an idea about his character. Even though it's late in his career, I want to start with that. In 1943, LaGuardia was in his third term as mayor, and by all accounts, including his own, he was bored. And not so much he was bored with being in charge, he liked that, but the United States was in a war. He had been a veteran of World War One, and he felt he wanted to be where the action was. That was always true of Fiorello. And to this point, he wanted to be overseas, back in uniform, all 5'2" of him. So he was badgering President Roosevelt, his good friend in the White House, and various people in the War Department, as the Defense Department was called back then, to get a commission, not as a captain or a major, which was his previous title. No, he wanted to be a brigadier general, and he wanted to be in service when the American army invaded Italy, which happened, in 1943, right? So in explaining to the War Secretary Henry Stinson why he wanted to leave the job of mayor of New York and become a brigadier general, he says in a letter, I never did like politics, which I'm sure the Secretary of War must have read that letter and said, really? You've been mayor of New York since 1934. You were a congressman for the better part of 10 years. You never liked it? And of course, one of the things we're going to see about Fiorello LaGuardia is he loved government, but he actually didn't like politics. He considered politics to be a dirty business. And of course, on a day like today, who of us would disagree, given what his successor many times over is going through. But it was a great strength of Fiorello LaGuardia's, and I think also a bit of a weakness, that he didn't like the political process. He considered himself to be above politics. And while that may explain why, unlike the current mayor, he got through his tenure without any major scandals, and why nobody ever cast aspersions on his integrity, the flip side of that is he wasn't very easy to get along with. And he did manage to get stuff done. And that's often the trade-off, right? You get somebody who, lives and breathes politics and maybe, isn't the most upstanding citizen, but she knows how to get things done, right? Well, LaGuardia, didn't like politics and yet was able to figure out how to get things done. And some of it was sheer force of personality. He is, to this day, I think I'll be interested to hear an opinion otherwise, but he certainly, in my view, is the gold standard of mayors in New York City. We have not seen the likes of him since. And I think that speaks to his character, and I think it speaks to his force of personality. So that's Fiorello. He never did like politics. So let me see if I can figure out how to, there we go. So, of course, most of us, including my freshman students at the College of Staten Island, when they hear LaGuardia, of course, what do they think of but LaGuardia Airport in Queens? And rightfully so. Not only is LaGuardia, a major airport, but it's also his baby. LaGuardia came up with the idea for building an airfield in Queens. And you might think, okay, I mean, who wouldn't have thought of that? Well, New York hadn't thought of it. In the late 1930s, Fiorello was taking a flight home from Chicago, where he was at the Conference of Mayors, where he was president of the Conference of Mayors. And like every other flight bound for New York, it landed in Newark, which had what posed as a world-class airport back then. And everybody got off because that's what you do. And then you would take a ferry to Manhattan, except for this sort of boisterous chap in the back of the plane who held up his ticket and said, my ticket says Chicago to New York, so you're taking me to New York. And the captain came back and said, well, but Mayor, Your Honor, everybody's left. Fiorello said, doesn't matter. You have to bring me to New York, by which he meant Floyd Bennett Field, which was the only airport in New York City, and the airlines disdained it because it was too far from Manhattan. And I think it probably was not able to handle, quote unquote, modern aircraft. So the manager of Newark Airport comes out and says, look, the mayor, we cannot do this. And the mayor said, well, looks like you're going to have to. So they bring the mayor, the sole passenger, to Floyd Bennett Field. And surprisingly, there were reporters waiting for the mayor. And that's when he says, New York has to have an airport. We have to have a better airport than Floyd Bennett Field, and we're not going to allow Newark. He didn't say this, but he meant it. We're not going to allow Newark to become the major hub. So LaGuardia himself was a pilot, as we'll see when we talk about his World War I service. So he badgered Franklin Roosevelt. He badgered Harry Hopkins, who was the head of the Works Progress Administration, until they agreed to use WPA money to build what is today LaGuardia Airport. And I should know this for sure. I'm going to guess and say it took something like a year and a half to build. It was the largest WPA project in the country in the late 30s. They were working triple shifts round the clock to get this thing done. And when it was open, it wasn't called LaGuardia. It was called, I think, something like, North Shore Municipal Airport, but not something like that. That's not the exact title, but the point is it wasn't called LaGuardia. The councilmen, the Board of Aldermen, the City Common Council, in their wisdom, passed a resolution naming the airport after Fiorello LaGuardia. And I think with some joy, Fiorello signed that resolution. And that is the genesis of LaGuardia Airport. I don't think Fiorello would have been too happy at the condition of LaGuardia Airport a few years ago, but that was a few years ago. So here are the highlights of his career for those of you who don't know, like most of my students, who are, after all, only freshmen. But, frankly, when I started writing this book, there was a good deal about Fiorello's biography that I didn't know either. So I just want to familiarize you before we get into the bigger story. So he was born in New York City in Greenwich Village in 1882 of Italian immigrant parents. What's interesting there, as his biographer Thomas Kessner points out, and if you want to read the definitive account of Fiorello's life, Thomas Kessner, that's the book. It's 800 pages. But Thomas Kessner is a wonderful storyteller and a scholar. It's a rare combination. But as he points out in his book, by the way, if any of you ever tell my publisher or my editor that I plugged another book, I'm going to deny it. I know this is recorded, but we can delete it, that part, right? Kessner points out that Fiorello's parents made a conscious decision to move to the village rather than Little Italy. And he sees that as a sign that Fiorello's parents wanted him to grow up in a more cosmopolitan area, right? A part of New York, rather than go to, for lack of a better phrase, and I certainly don't mean this pejoratively, but rather than go to an ethnic ghetto, he went to the village. And we'll see why that's important, because he later lives in the village again. Here's what I did know about Fiorello. At the age of 3, his family moved out west because his father joined the army as a musician. So they moved around from town to town, as army brats will. And Fiorello described himself as an army brat. He was in South Dakota. He was in the North Country up in the Adirondacks. But the place that he was most at home, the place where he said he felt the happiest, was not, I'm sorry to tell you, not the village. It was Prescott, Arizona, where he spent the formative years of his life as an army brat near the army base there in Prescott. And I believe there's a statue of LaGuardia in Prescott. I had no idea. And in his autobiography, he waxes poetic about what it was like growing up in Prescott, Arizona. So I found that interesting. The family eventually returns to Italy, as many Italian migrants did back then. Most Italian migrants back then were young men who went back and forth, in accordance with the work. But this was a family, so that was rare. They moved back to Italy after the Spanish-American War, during which Fiorello's father ate some tainted meat and was discharged and was never the same. And he died rather quickly after their moving back to Italy, I think in 1900, 1901. And Fiorello never forgot. I mean, didn't say this so bluntly, but I think he felt he was murdered by sinister contractors who had sold the army bad meat. Anyway, he returns to Italy, grows up there, gets a job with the consulate in Hungary when he's about 18 years old. That person, his mentor in the consular service, tells him, what you ought to do is you ought to learn to speak another language. That's really going to help you. Well, he didn't stop with learning one. He wound up speaking 5 languages, English being one of them: Italian, German, Serbo-Croatian, and Yiddish. And it was said he could curse you out in all 5, and often did. He eventually moves back to the United States because he tells his mother, who's a widow now, like, I want to be somebody. So there's that, sort of American spirit, I want to be somebody. And he gets a job, lo and behold, as a translator on Ellis Island, where he is seeing the immigrant story and literally telling the immigrant story, because he is telling Ellis Island officials the stories of these immigrants. And I think that explains a lot of what we'll talk about later about his sympathy for immigrants, because he saw the immigration experience on the other side of the Atlantic when he was working with the consulate in Hungary, and then he sees it on Ellis Island. He gets an apartment in the village. I don't know what the rent was, so don't ask. And he joined some civic organizations in preparation for his political career. And again, as Thomas Kessner points out in his book, he sort of adopts, or is adopted by, a lot of Italian-American intellectuals and musicians and artists in the village. And they get together once a week. Fiorello is often in charge of preparing the dinner. And what's interesting is Kessner argues, and I copy that argument, that, or not copy it, but I agree with it, that, he soaked in that village atmosphere like a sponge. He heard all these ideas going back. There were communists, they were anarchists, there were Catholic social activists. It was a wonderful combination that you only get in the village, right? And he absorbed it like a sponge. He wasn't necessarily the most intellectual of that crowd, but boy, he was a quick study. And Kessner thinks that this formative intellectual experience for LaGuardia happened in the village as he's preparing to run for office. He was elected to Congress in 1916. He therefore becomes a member in 1917, obviously. His first big vote as a member of Congress is the gravest vote any member of Congress can ever make, a vote to go to war, which of course hasn't happened since December 8th, 1941, when Congress last voted a declaration of war, right? But LaGuardia votes in favor of World War I, even though some of his fellow progressives, I should mention that LaGuardia is a Republican, a very progressive Republican. He loathes Democrats in New York because he associates them with Tammany Hall, which I think, by the way, is unfair, but that's another argument for another time. But he votes in favor of the war. And as a matter of principle, he says, if I vote in favor of war, I'm young enough, I should serve in that war. So he volunteers for war service. At one point, he is asked something about his qualifications. He mentions that he had taken some flying lessons on Long Island. And they said, oh, great, you'll be a pilot. So he is shipped off. He is deployed to Italy in late 1917 or early 1918 as a combat pilot, and as also somebody who is training pilots in Italy. He's married in 1919, one of the great tragedies of his life that he spoke about, as far as I can tell, only once in his life. He lost his baby and his wife within months in 1921. The baby had spinal meningitis. His wife, who was 26 at the time, had tuberculosis. And he blamed their deaths on the close quarters, the unhealthy city life. Now, he wasn't living in a tenement per se in the village. He was living in the village then, but he always blamed their deaths on conditions that ought to be ameliorated. And he said, if I ever get to be mayor, I'm going to make life better so that nobody has to go through what I went through. He is elected mayor in 1933. He finishes his third and final term in 1945, and he dies quite soon afterwards of pancreatic cancer in 1947. So those are the highlights of his career. That's the time frame I talk about. I try to do this all the time so that people have a sense of what the time is. It's especially critical when I teach 18-year-old college freshmen for whom 1918, 2018, sort of the same, right? So that's his biography. There we go. So what I did in this book, it's not Thomas Kestner's book. Thomas Kestner is the definitive biography. God, this is the third time I've said that, isn't it? But because it is a definitive biography, my editor and I agreed to do this book more thematically. So it jumps, just like I do in this lecture, it jumps around in time. But what I did was I divided his life and career into 4 themes: patriot, dissenter, leader, and statesman. I think those 4 themes really bring out all of the aspects of Fiorello's career and life that I wanted to talk about in the book. So the book is really a collection of stories within those themes. And again, it's not in chronological order, and that is intended. I just thought it was a better way to tell Fiorello's story to, frankly, a more accessible audience. I mean, my book is almost as tall as he was, and it's not 800 pages. So anyway, those are the themes. So let's start with the first one, the idea of LaGuardia as a patriot. LaGuardia loved this country and loved sharing his patriotism. His favorite day was every year when he swore in new immigrants as citizens. And the speeches he gave were from the heart, and you could tell that this is a man who truly loved the United States. There are many ways to show patriotism, right? We all, well, those of us who wish to be patriotic are patriotic in our own ways, as he was. But one of the other ways he was a patriot is that he was willing to give his life for his country. And the most obvious instance of that is in World War I, where, as I said, he volunteers his services as a congressman, as a sitting congressman, and is put in the line of fire in Italy in 1918 at the final stages of World War I. And as I mentioned to you, he was a pilot. There he is in his uniform behind a plane. When I say he was a pilot, that might kind of be an exaggeration. He was in the pilot's seat of airplanes. But as he once said, I can't take off the buzzards, I can't land them, but I can fly them. How'd you like to have the captain in your next flight say that? And it was true. He was not a good pilot, right? There was one point during his war service, he's training Italian pilots, and he's trying to land his own plane, and he keeps having to abort his landing. And by about the 3rd or 4th try, one of his colleagues says, okay, he's either gonna run out of fuel and crash, or he's gonna starve to death and we'll have to shoot him down. So that gives you an idea. Having said that, hey, he saw combat. He was fired upon by German airplanes over the air in France, in Italy rather. But one thing the Italian pilots decided was that, first of all, maybe they shouldn't be taking lessons from someone who can't land a plane. And when they went on bombing missions, he was assigned to one of the really good Italian pilots. he was assigned to be the bombardier over German lines. And what the bombardier did back then in those primitive stages of air warfare is literally they threw the bombs. He was in the back of the plane throwing bombs down. That he could do. And he apparently got along famously with his other pilots. The other thing during World War I is at a certain point, the Germans are pressing down, right? Because this is sort of their last big offensive. They're pressing down from northern Italy down towards the Tuscany. And the Italians are beginning to lose faith in the Americans. And German propaganda is telling the Italians the only reason the Americans entered the war was to prolong it so that they could, have more influence at the peace treaty. LaGuardia is assigned the task, and honestly, I don't remember how it came about, except that, remember, he is a congressman. He is still a congressman. So he is assigned the task, because he can speak Italian, of going to several Italian cities, Florence, Venice, finishing in Rome, but other places as well, talking about Woodrow Wilson, talking about the fact that the United States was in the war to make the world safe for democracy. And the consul general in Florence, I believe, but certainly a U.S. diplomat in any case, told LaGuardia, Congressman, here's the deal. If you're a failure, we never told you anything. You did this on your own. If you're a success, however, we will welcome you home. Well, he was a success. The New York Times wrote an editorial talking about the wonderful work LaGuardia was doing in turning these skeptical Italians into pro-Americans. And when he comes home, he is so popular in his congressional district, which includes the Village, that the Tammany Democrats, in their wisdom, in 1918 say, we're not running anybody against him. In fact, we're going to endorse him. So LaGuardia, who later becomes the arch enemy of Tammany, actually was endorsed by Tammany Hall for his congressional reelection in 1918. So I knew nothing about his military career, and it's filled with other colorful stories too, where he's basically defying the commanding officers to benefit his troops, to get them better food, for example, and other things. But there's a lot of wonderful stories in my book about his war service, which of course only took up about a year and a half of his time. So that's him as a patriot, right? I mean, for all of the hilarity and not being able to fly a plane properly, well, think about that. I mean, yeah, he did in fact crash land one of his flights, but he was willing to do that for the sake of making the world safe for democracy, right? So he was a true patriot, but he was also a dissenter. And what the point I make in the book is that is a true patriot, right? A true patriot isn't somebody who says my country right or wrong, which is what some people think, and perhaps some of you think as well. I would argue that the true patriot is the patriot who says, no, we're not living up to my expectations for what this country should be. And what we're doing actually is an injustice to ourselves, to our Constitution, to our idea of who we are. Well, that was very much Fiorello LaGuardia as well, right? And through his years in Congress, he was one of the loudest, most rambunctious, stubbornest dissenter from almost everything that was going on in the United States in the 1920s. Prohibition, immigration restrictions, trickle-down economics, those three major issues, LaGuardia was raving on the House floor against all three. I'll start with prohibition because there's the picture. So you're probably all waiting, like, what the heck is going on there, right? Well, I'll tell you. First of all, prohibition offended him. Not that he was a heavy drinker. I think he liked a glass of wine every now and again, but the hypocrisy of prohibition bothered him. And the idea that with, a simple, well, not so simple, constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, and then the Volstead Act, turned ordinary Americans into criminals for just enjoying what they had enjoyed all of their lives. So he felt, and he also felt, and I think rightfully so, that there was very much an anti-immigrant, anti-urban feel to prohibition. Who were the biggest prohibitionists? They tended to be, frankly, dry Protestants from the Midwest and from rural areas, right? Among the biggest prohibitionists or the biggest fans of prohibition were the KKK, right? So I think he saw that the prohibition as part of a cultural war against people like him. Now, again, not that he was a heavy drinker, but that he was an ethnic living in the city. So at one point in the late 20s, he decides he's going to show the hypocrisy of prohibition for all to see. He holds a press conference in his congressional office, and he takes two beverages. One is a malt beverage of some sort that was perfectly legal for medicinal use, though, don't you know? And another beverage, and frankly, the other beverage is escaping me, but it was like 0.05 alcohol, which is, if you drink non-alcohol beer, as I do on occasion, that's sort of what it is, right? 0.05. Anyway, he mixes these two things together, as the picture shows, and he does something very smart. He starts handing out this concoction to reporters. Now, I don't know if you know this or not. I can say this as a journalist of 40 years, but there's a rumor that reporters occasionally like to have a cold one. Just a thought. So he's handing out the beers to the reporters, and he's saying, look, perfectly legal beverage, boink, put it together. There you go. What do you think, fellas? Because they were all men back then. Well, they loved it, right? And LaGuardia got this hilarious news item. But meanwhile, literally across the street, the Prohibition League and the Anti-Saloon League and these people are beside themselves. And they're saying that, Fiorello LaGuardia is a criminal. Like, how can this be? This member of Congress is violating the Volstead Act and violating the spirit of the 18th Amendment. So there's that, right? So that happens in Washington. Well, it was such a success that LaGuardia did it again a couple of weeks later in front of a drugstore in East Harlem. And by now he had moved to East Harlem. So he was no longer living in the Village. And he does it again, and he calls reporters over and says, here you go, fellas, try it. Everybody likes it, or at least they say they do, right? And then at one point, a police officer is going by, and LaGuardia sort of spreads out people, right? Like, imagine Lou Costello doing that in a Abbott Costello movie. Get out of my way. And he calls over to the police officer and says, police officer, I'm making beer. The police officer, who clearly was one of the smartest members of the force in 1927, said, all right. And LaGuardia says, well, why don't you arrest me? And that police officer said the single smartest thing anybody could say, which was basically, that's not my job. That's a job for the prohibition agent, which was actually true. In 1923, the state of New York said in a law that, signed by Al Smith, that New York police officials would no longer enforce the Volstead Act, which was the act that was used to enforce prohibition. So that, look, if you federal people, you prohibition agents, you want to go around catching people in the act, catching, I don't know, the mayor of New York at a nightclub, that's up to you, right? But we're not going to enforce the Volstead Act. So LaGuardia was actually right about that. It wasn't the cop's job to arrest him. So he was pretty annoyed about that, because that would have been the greatest photo op of him being let off in handcuffs for taking two perfectly legal beverages and turning them into something that the 18th Amendment said was illegal. So there's that dissent, right? Immigration, obviously a hot button issue today, right? His parents were immigrants. He worked on Ellis Island. He worked with immigrants. He told their stories. So in 1924, exactly 100 years ago, right, the United States Congress passed the Immigration Quota Act, or the National Origins Act, basically the immigration reform of 1924, which put quotas on countries where we basically didn't want any more people. One of those countries was Italy, where the quota was about 6,000 for comparison's sake, the UK, that quota was 66,000, right? It basically closed the door on Italians and Eastern European Jews and Chinese and many Asian countries as well. But if you look at the debates, they're mostly talking about Europeans that they don't want. And of course, LaGuardia took this personally, and rightfully so. And he is amazing. When you read the transcripts of his speeches and the debates he got into, and at that time, there was this notion of the Nordic race, which sounds a lot like what we would hear in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Let me tell you something. That rhetoric was being said on the House floor in the 1920s in the United States, where literally people are saying, we need more people of Nordic stock. And one guy, and of course it's nearly all men in the House back then, Jeanette Rankin from New Hampshire, I think was in there, but mostly all men. One guy says at one point, to prove his point about the superiority of the Nordic race, and by Nordic race I mean English and German, that Christopher Columbus could not have been Italian because he was such a good navigator. Well, I don't need to tell you what Fiorello LaGuardia had to say about that. And at one point, one of his colleagues in the House, looking at LaGuardia, says something like, well, I don't know what it's like in your country. And LaGuardia gets up and says, my country is the United States of America. LaGuardia was the first and at the time still only Italian American in Congress. So he was a curiosity for lots of reasons. So that's LaGuardia railing against the racism built into the Immigration Act of 1924. And again, as we understand, race today, it's an interesting issue, isn't it? Because it was racist, mostly aimed at white Europeans. But then you get into the whole question of who is white, right? And I understand that. But this Immigration Act was clearly meant for people named Fiorello LaGuardia and for people from the shtetls of Eastern Europe, right? There's no, they didn't try to hide it. That's what it was about. And LaGuardia spent the rest of his congressional career until he was defeated in 1932, arguing against this racist, as at one point he said, this worship of the Anglo-Saxon, which he's saying, I think at one point he calls it demented, right? It's fabulous. And then about the economics of the time, of course, this is the time of Calvin Coolidge. This is the time of Andrew Mellon, Treasury Secretary, who is cutting the top income tax rates for rich people. It's Reaganomics, right? It's supply side economics being applied in the 1920s. And LaGuardia also is railing against that and talking about the importance of people paying their fair share of taxes. If you hear him talking about taxation, you might be thinking, am I reading Bernie Sanders in 2024, or maybe Kamala Harris? Or am I reading LaGuardia in 1924? And the answer is you're reading LaGuardia. That issue was very much in play. In 1924, this is how much of a individual he was. He is so put off by everything he's seeing in his Republican Party in 1924 that he announces he is not going to support Calvin Coolidge for president, mostly on economic issues. And the Republican Party says to him, the local Republican Party says to him, all right, you're not going to support Calvin Coolidge? We're not going to support you for re-election. You've just lost the Republican line. Lots of luck. He no longer, Democrats aren't going to run him, right? Democrats see an opportunity now. The Socialist Party, which is very active in New York, as some of you probably know, in the 19-teens and 1920s, Socialist Party, and today, the Socialist Party offers Fiorello their line, even though they know he's not a socialist, but on lots of issues, they're pretty close. So he accepts the Socialist Party line and wins re-election by I think I'm almost sure he collects the most number of votes he ever collected in a congressional race on the Socialist Party line, right? And, you know, the Republicans eventually begrudgingly let him back into their caucus, but that's how he won re-election in 1924, by basically telling his own party, screw you, right? And they tried to reply in kind, and it didn't work out the way they wanted. So that's LaGuardia as a dissenter, right? And you can hear the disappointment in his voice, or imagine the disappointment in his voice, because you're just reading the transcripts. But he loves the United States so much that he literally is brokenhearted when it is failing other Americans. And I think, that truly is the definition of a patriot, as well as a dissenter, right? So that's it. Then, of course, 1933, he runs for mayor. And I should also point out, he ran for mayor in 1929 as sort of the sacrificial lamb against the very popular Jimmy Walker, who's kind of been in the news lately because he was corrupt. Eventually had to resign the mayoralty. I don't know why that's relevant to today, but anyway, he ran, lost, but ran a good race. Walker resigned on September 1st, 1932. And as an aside, by the way, he was under investigation. Walker was. And there was pressure on Governor Franklin Roosevelt, who's running for president, to do what people want Kathy Hochul to do to Eric Adams, which is remove him, because he does have that power. So what Roosevelt did in August of 1932, shortly after winning the nomination for the Democratic Party for president, is he basically had a trial where Roosevelt said, I will be the judge and the jury. Walker spent 2 weeks being questioned by Franklin Roosevelt, and the pressure is building on Roosevelt to fire him, right? To remove him. But Roosevelt is running for president and wants Tammany Hall's support. Yeah, he did want it, and wants support from other urban, i.e. Irish, political machines. What to do? And it was at a stalemate in late August when Governor Al Smith, who had mentored Jimmy Walker, said to Walker, Jimmy, you're finished. And Walker resigned the next day or the day after. And Smith was mostly offended by Walker's philandering. I'm sure he was offended by the bribe taking, but the philandering is what really offended Al Smith. So in any case, right? So Walker's gone. A guy called McKee comes in as acting mayor. He serves 3 months, but there's a special election, and Tammany elects a guy named O'Brien as mayor to fill out the rest of Walker's term. Now it's 1933. Mayor's term is up. O'Brien is the incumbent. He is regarded as a fool, as an incompetent, and New York City is going bankrupt because there's a depression going on. At one point, the reporters say to Mayor O'Brien, Mayor, Your Honor, who's going to be your police commissioner? To which he says, in one of the most honest statements that any mayor has ever made, he said, I don't know. They haven't told me yet. Well, it was widely regarded that New York could not take 4 more years of Mayor O'Brien. So LaGuardia becomes the Republican nominee. And, he's the favorite until 2 of Franklin Roosevelt's aides, Ed Flynn, who was the boss of Bronx County, and Jim Farley, who is Franklin Roosevelt's postmaster general and the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, put in a third candidate, that guy McKee, who had been the acting mayor, and he's thought to be pretty good. Now there's a 3-way race, and the candidate McKee is running on a new party called the Recovery Party, and everybody thinks McKee has Roosevelt's blessing, and so do Flynn and Farley, and they're waiting for their boss to endorse the Recovery Party. He never did. And Fiorello LaGuardia won that contest with 40% of the vote, and won because the Democratic vote was split. Now, he probably would have beaten O'Brien, come to think of it, but if O'Brien had dropped out and it was McKee versus LaGuardia, boy, that would have been interesting. Or if Roosevelt had endorsed McKee on the Recovery Party, I mean, we might not be having this conversation. I might not have written that book. Thomas Kessner would have had to find something else to do. But he did, right? And he's elected mayor and is by, right, all accounts, the greatest mayor New York has ever seen. Some of the things he did, he created NYCHA, which I know NYCHA has fallen into disrepair literally lately, but public housing was a new thing. And this is LaGuardia saying, I am going to clean up New York quite literally by putting people in better housing so that people don't have to go through what I went through when my wife, 26-year-old wife, died of tuberculosis. We're going to put air in, we're going to make these apartments clean, and we're going to make life better for the working poor and poor. He built the airport, as we know. It was the largest WPA project. We know his parks commissioner was Robert Moses. Don't throw anything at the screen, please. Not going to hit me anyway, you know. But Moses was his master builder. They did not get along, but they needed each other, right? And the joke was, actually it wasn't a joke, Moses had threatened to quit so many times that at one point, LaGuardia had a letter of resignation written for him. And when he came in one day and said, "That's it, Your Honor," I think he called him Fiorello, actually. "That's it, Fiorello, I've done." LaGuardia took out the letter of resignation and said, "Oh, okay, here, you want to sign? It's right there on the dotted line. You can sign." Well, he didn't, as we know, right? He reformed the NYPD. The first thing he did as mayor after he was sworn in is he went down to police headquarters and he assembled a bunch of police officers who were on duty and their commanders. And he said, if you think you're going to get promoted because of who you know, quit now. If you think you're going to go easy on some street criminals because they're friendly with you or they give you bribes, quit now. He was basically laid down the law, but he was also pro-law enforcement. So he reformed the police department and I think made it a better department because he insisted on standards, but he also insisted that it not use the police officers not use force, out of proportion to what they needed. He walked the streets of Harlem in 1943 during a race riot that was set off by a rumor or an exaggeration of an incident involving the police and an African-American man. The rumor was the man was dead. He wasn't. He was grazed by a bullet, which probably shouldn't have been fired. But nevertheless, Harlem erupted. LaGuardia himself went to the streets of Harlem and went on WNYC multiple times during the night and asked people to go home. And even LaGuardia's worst critic at the time in Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., said, yeah, he did a good job. His record on race relations is problematic to our 2024 eyes and ears, but for his time, he was very much progressive. He did agree to allow MetLife to build Stuytown as a whites-only project, and that disappointed his Black supporters to no end. So there's that too. And some of us have grown up on stories about LaGuardia on the radio, reading the comics. Well, first of all, he had his own radio show every Sunday called Talk to the People. And he did a lot of that. He did a lot of talk, almost as much as I'm doing. From 1943 to the end of his mayoralty, 2 million people tuned in every Sunday. WNYC would kill for that now, right? Any radio station would. And if you go on WNYC's archives and listen to some of his Talk to the People, which if you're really interested, I recommend you do, he's hilarious. The guy was a born showman. But of course, what we all remember in our folk memory is that he read the comics on the radio. He only did that 3 times. In the first 3 Sundays in July, because there was a newspaper distributor strike, and he felt that the kids were missing their comics. So he did it. And talk to people about Fiorello LaGuardia, and that's the one thing they remember, or they remember at this point, but they remember being told about that. So that's him as mayor. And here's where I see him as a statesman. I'm very conscious of time too, by the way. That's why I'm talking even faster than I normally do. At the end of his mayoralty, President Harry Truman asked him to serve as the commissioner of the United Nations Refugee Organization. It's not the United Nations that we know today. Back then, the Allies, the Allied powers that were fighting the Axis, were often referred to as the United Nations. And his job after World War II was to feed and clothe the refugees of Europe, which included his daughter. No, I'm sorry, not his daughter, his sister, whose husband had been sent to a concentration camp. Because, which I should have mentioned, their mother, LaGuardia's mother, was Jewish from Italy, right? LaGuardia's brother-in-law was killed in a concentration camp. His sister became a refugee, and her daughter. So LaGuardia was an advocate for these refugees. And in one of his first speeches, when he takes over the refugee organization, he says, the quote's there, right? Like, we're going to get these people fed, right? We throw out, enough food in New York every day. I know that because I picked up the garbage, right? So it's amazing to see LaGuardia astride or in a global stage, acting very much like the Fiorello LaGuardia that New Yorkers had come to love. Basically, don't give me any excuses. Get the job done. There are people's lives at stake. And he did that job for about a year. And then he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And as sadly we know from that terrible disease, he didn't last much long after that. But I'll just wrap up with, luckily I've already talked about that. But there, not only did he read the comics, but there was a comic strip about him, starring him, right? And there he is, by the way, in his Stetson hat. Why did LaGuardia wear those seemingly silly Stetson hats? Because he loved the West. And there he is. There's the statue of him in the village, right? I had to end with that because I'm sure some of you are familiar with that statue. It's a great image of him, isn't it? I mean, when I think of Fiorello LaGuardia, that's the exact pose that I picture him in. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry that I carried on and on. I'm a little enthusiastic about the topic, as you might have imagined. I hope you are now too.
Terry, thank you. That was incredible and no apologies needed. Absolutely. I think everyone was riveted. I was sitting here just eating up every word. So folks, if you have questions, pop those into the chat in the Q&A. But I'll go ahead and start with one of my questions because you're so enthusiastic about him and so I know what brought you to write the book and what is kind of your favorite thing about him?
Very good questions. And I'll give you a very honest answer. I probably would not have written this book on my own. My editor, Elizabeth Dygresgard at St. Martin's, who's much younger than I, but loves Fiorello LaGuardia. She's a great historian herself and always wanted to publish a book about Fiorello LaGuardia. And basically she took me aside and said, "You're the man." And what's ironic about that is the book that I had done with her most recently was about Al Smith and who's Tammany, and I've also written a book called Machine Made, which has basically been interpreted as a defense of Tammany Hall, if you can believe that. So here I was writing a biography of Tammany's greatest enemy. I think the thing that impressed me most about him, and it's not a specific thing, it's a general thing, is his absolute integrity. Because obviously on a day like today, any politician with integrity looks good, right? But he was the real thing. He was in politics to serve the people, and he never lost sight of that.
And that's like interesting kind of jumping off of that because in some ways we may, seeing what we've seen today, become cynical about politics and politicians. And here was a guy that had integrity, but could get things done. How do you think he was able to do that, to keep his head above some of the dirtier aspects of politics and accomplish the things that he did?
Well, he did have Robert Moses, right, who sort of did some of the things that LaGuardia could sort of say, keep his distance from, right? So there was that. But also, I think because he built up such goodwill and because his integrity was, beyond question. He was able to go to the public when he wanted to get things done. He could go to the public and know the public was behind him, right? That's a really great quality to have in a political leader, right? You can try to get things done, but if you don't have public opinion behind you, it's just not going to happen. But LaGuardia always did. I mean, his re-elections in 1937 and 1941, were smashing personal victories. So it took a lot of nerve to oppose anything Fiorello LaGuardia wanted because he was so beloved.
And him being so loved by New Yorkers. But when you were telling the story about the building of LaGuardia Airport and he was coming from that mayor's conference in Chicago, what were some of the views of him outside of New York and across the country, and maybe by fellow mayors, like let's say the mayor of Chicago?
They loved him too. In fact, at one point in the book, I quote a letter from somebody who was whose name is now escaping me, and probably would not be a name anybody would recognize, but he was friendly with Franklin Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia. And he writes, perhaps with some exaggeration, saying, "Who would have guessed that the two best known people in the United States today are Franklin Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia?" Now, mind you, as you point out, LaGuardia is a municipal official. The mayor of New York is always a national figure, but nobody was a national figure quite like Fiorello LaGuardia.
As you were researching your book, was there a favorite anecdote of all the money that you've already shared, but like was there, I don't know, a letter or an anecdote or something that as you got to know Fiorello LaGuardia that really stuck out to you that you really, really enjoyed?
Well, enjoyed is an interesting word. What really increased my admiration for him was when I came across the speeches he gave against Hitler from the get-go, from the very beginning. He is denouncing Hitler to the point where he's making international news by calling him things like a brown-shirted fanatic, to the point where in, I guess, 37 or so, maybe 37, 38, the State Department actually apologizes to the Nazi government in Berlin for LaGuardia's intemperate attacks on Hitler. And when the German consulate here in New York says that because of LaGuardia's rhetoric, their diplomats are in danger, they want more police protection, he assigns 2 Jewish police officers to the German consulate. That's the kind of guy he was.
And to kind of to wrap up the evening and this really incredible talk, he is this larger than life character. What are some of the takeaways you think that politicians could take from him to do better today? I'm trying to be polite with how I describe it, but yeah, what inspiration could they take from him?
Well, first of all, don't take discount airline fees from Turkish Airlines. That would be number one, right? But for the most part, remember this is supposed to be public service, right? And I know that sounds like a cliche, and it sounds like something I say to my political science students, but it's true. It's not about you. It's about us. It's about we the people. Uh, what I think it shows is that if you can, and I think LaGuardia's career also shows, if you can get the people behind you, great things can happen. You can achieve great things by having people love you. Of course, we've also seen that demagogues can achieve terrible things by getting people to love them. So that's, it's you have to be careful. But in LaGuardia's case, the people were with him. And, the New York City that many of you live in, that I used to live in, is very much a creation of the brain of Fiorello LaGuardia in the 1930s.
Incredible. Terry, thank you so very much for sharing your time and your enthusiasm. You had me loving LaGuardia when you said he loved to curse in multiple languages.
I wish I could.
My grandfather was Hungarian, and Those were the things I learned from him. And Hungarian is the poetry of cursing when you curse in Hungarian. So I can understand why he enjoyed it. But thank you again for this incredible presentation. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who joined us this evening. Hope to see you at future programs for village preservation. Please go out and get Terry's book and read even more about this incredible historical figure. Terry, one more time, a big thank you and a very good evening to everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.